Okay, good morning, everyone in Indonesia, in Southeast Asian countries, and also good afternoon, very good afternoon to our honorable speaker, Prof. Risalind Gibson. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's online lecture series on best practices in dietary assessment. I'm Umi Fahmida, honored to be moderator for today's sessions, where we will have well-known experts in nutritional assessment and dietary assessment, Prof. Risalind Gibson from Otago University, New Zealand. This online lecture series is part of the Southeast Asia Regional Postgraduate Training on Best Practices in Dietary Assessment, held by Senior Rekfon. And the full class session is actually throughout this week from Tuesday to Saturday. And we are lucky that we can also have two well-known experts the previous 2 days with Dr. Elaine Ferguson of London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and today with well-known Professor Risalind Gibson of Otago University. Hello, Prof. Gibson. Greetings again from Jakarta. I know it is like 5 hours faster earlier in New Zealand now. So you're around like 2 p.m. and we are here like 9 a.m. in Jakarta. So on behalf of the committee at Senior Rekfon and also the participants, we thank you so much again for your time amidst your busy time. And to brief you on our participants this year, we have 36 participants from 6 countries in Southeast Asia, so Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, and Thailand. And also for this online lecture series, we are also joined by other participants, including the Indonesian Food Composition Table Task Force, the Indonesian National Food Consumption Survey Team, and of course, participants from our National Institute of Health Research and Development. And besides the 36 participants who joined the full course, Ross, we also have the participants joining online through the YouTube. And for this online series, we have received quite a number of interests for the 3 online lectures. There is around 300 registered participants, not only from Southeast Asia, but also from beyond.
Oh my.
So before we move to the main session, which is the lecture of Professor Risalind Gibson, please allow me to inform you the rules of today's sessions. Please host to help us screen the rules. So for those participants who are joining us through the YouTube channels, you already have this link, and for the other participants joining in the Zoom, please make sure that you mute your your voice during the sessions. There are evaluation form which we would like you to fill to complete at the end of the sessions. And for the other participants who are joining the sessions, not the class participants, we also will provide you with the certificates which will be given to you upon completion of your evaluation form. So we will share the link to the evaluations form prior to the end of the sessions. And we will be sending you your certificates around 3 weeks after this online lecture series. And don't forget to keep subscribing to Senior Rekfon on YouTube channel, because we will be happy to share with you more and more beneficial topics from the experts. And we will have a question answer session after the lecture of Prof. Gibson. And this is the link that you can use to put your question answer sessions. And please make sure make your questions or opinion brief and clear for our effective discussion. Okay, so thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you know all Professor Risalind Gibson, a well-known writer of the textbook, A Principle of Nutritional Assessment, but allow me to also add more introductions of Professor Risalind Gibson. A slide, please.
Okay, do you see it?
Yes. Okay. Oh, you look great, Ross. Actually, so this is the picture some time ago, and I think you still look quite the same. And,
oh, I don't think so, Umi. You're being very, very flashing. I'm getting rather old.
So, Professor Gibson, we all know, is from, she's now the Emeritus Professor in Human Nutrition at University of Otago at Dunedin, New Zealand. Her PhD is from the University of London for the work on zinc in premature infant. And this is the study that initiated her lifelong interest in micronutrient human nutrition. In '79, Professor Gibson moved to the University of Guelph, Ontario. And while in Canada, she worked to raise the profile of trace elements in human nutrition, particularly zinc for the population group. And for the last 20 years, Professor Risalind Gibson has also turned her attention to working on micronutrient nutrition in developing countries, with emphasis on sustainable diet-based, food-based strategies to combat micronutrient deficiencies. So this work in developing countries has continued since moving to New Zealand. And she has received quite a number of awards. In 2002, a fellowship at the Royal Society of New Zealand. In 2007, a fellow of the American Institute of Nutrition. And she's also, of course, a founding expert for the International Zinc Consultative Group. And I'm sure very soon you will hear about another award given to Prof. Risalind Gibson in June this year. So I think I cannot introduce, I can only introduce some of your achievements and your experiences, but without further ado, I think now everyone is looking forward to your lecture. Prof. Risalind Gibson, time is yours. We can have a session for up to 90 minutes for your lecture, so take your time. And after that, we will be open to the question-answer session. For the participants, you can type your questions directly during the session. So, Professor Gibson, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Umi. Can you hear me?
Very well, very clear.
Good. Well, it's a pleasure to be here again. I've missed you all, so it's very nice to be back. I hope everybody has been able to keep safe in this rather challenging time. So I'm going to be talking about my experiences in planning, conducting, and analyzing data in national food consumption surveys. So first of all, I'll talk about some of the strategies that we need to do for the planning and sampling of the survey, and then some of the factors associated with choosing a 24-hour recall method for the survey. Then I will discuss some of the details of training the research assistants and what are some new options that we can use for actually using 24-hour recalls in a tablet or on a phone. And then I'll be going through assessing dietary adequacy, which may be something that Dr. Elaine Ferguson has already addressed, and some of the applications of the dietary survey data that can be used. I've also provided a lot of PDFs, which I sent earlier, that you can have so that you can look up some of these points that I'm discussing in your own time later on. So this first slide shows a figure on the left of the countries in 2017 who had conducted a national food consumption survey at the individual level. Increasing number of countries are carrying out these surveys because they have many applications, as you can see on the right. We can use them to develop food-based dietary guidelines for nutrition monitoring, assessing nutritional dietary adequacy, establishing food policies, particularly food fortification, designing food assistance programs, informing agricultural policies, and conducting nutrition research to study how diet and dietary patterns can help prevent diseases. I'd like to emphasize the words of Kofi Annan, who was the former Secretary General of the UN and a Nobel Prize winner. He said—
Excuse me, Ross. Sorry to interrupt. I think we need you to share screen so participants can follow your talk.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, because just now we take out the. So it is the green button on the bottom.
Yeah, I can't find it. That's the trouble. In Ian's disappeared. I'll have to get him. Is it display settings? Is it there?
On the bottom of your screen, you have the.
Oh, here we are. No, yeah. It's not. No, it's not that. I'll have to get Ian. I don't know where to. Ian.
Has to.
I had it. Ian. Ian, I need your help.
Laras. Yeah, because I think Prof. Gibson has an update from the version 2 years ago. So sorry, Ross. It's okay, take your time.
They can't see my slides. The share screen thing's not.
Oh,
it was on before.
Surprised.
It was on before. What happened to it?
I'm not surprised when Umi said stop sharing.
Sorry, yeah. Because before we have other screens and help is highly needed now, so we need the.
I don't know how to get it back.
I think we better go back to the
end slideshow. There, it's there now. Share screen there. Press it there. Now I'll start again. There. No, there. Yeah. Now, can you see it now?
Yeah, and yeah, we can see now, and maybe Ian can help to slideshow.
We'll get it to view. Go to slideshow. Press slideshow, Ian.
I am pressing slideshow.
There. Can you see it now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Well,
thanks, Ian.
How can we get rid of this?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Well, we can see you, so I don't know how to get rid of the people there, but it doesn't matter because you'll take.
That isn't our problem.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So can Risalind start again now, Umi?
Yes.
I'll start again. I'm sorry, we are not very familiar with this. So
no, I'm not familiar with the other version as well. So
I don't know how to remove
it's perfect now. We can see on the screen, Ross, and
yeah, but I can see you and me, and how I don't know how to get rid of that.
Don't worry.
Oh, okay.
That's at your end, not their end.
Well, I just want to emphasize the number of countries in this map who have actually completed a national dietary survey at the individual level and the applications that can be used for these data. And I also wanted to emphasize some very wise words of Kofi Annan that apply to national dietary survey data. He was the former Secretary General of the UN and a Nobel Prize winner. And he said, without good data, we're flying blind. If you can't see it, you can't solve it. And I think this emphasizes the importance of acquiring precise and accurate data in our national dietary surveys. So these are the factors to consider for survey planning. There are 4 factors that we need to consider. The first is the survey design and sampling, and this requires some assistance with a statistician. We need to know whether we want to collect a nationally representative survey, or are we going to concentrate on just high-risk groups, such as preschool children and women of reproductive age. This will affect how we sample. We also want to know whether we want to report the data at the national, regional, provincial level, and whether we even want to subdivide that data into urban and rural areas. The next thing we need to consider is the impact of seasonal variation on food consumption. Do we want to ensure that our national survey covers all seasons of the year? If so, the data for each design strata that we'll talk about later should also be representative of all seasons of the year. The third important factor that we have to consider in our national survey is the choice of our nutrient reference values. Are we going to use our own country nutrient reference values? Do they have estimated average requirements, or do they just have nutrient reference, nutrient intake values? Or are we going to use the FAO WHO nutrient reference values so that we can compare our values across countries? Or alternatively, are we going to select the harmonized values that have been recently compiled by Allen et al? And I've sent you all a PDF of that particular manuscript. And finally, we have to consider the survey domains. Are we going to divide our survey up by sex? What life stage groups are we going to use? Are we going to be concerned about comparisons of urban or rural areas? Are we going to be concerned about comparisons across ethnic groups? In New Zealand, for example, they divided their data according to whether they were Europeans, Maori, Pacific Islanders, or others. So they had different ethnic groups for their data. And finally, under our survey domains, the number of repeat 24-hour recalls per survey domain. Oh, no. Dear. Now I'd like to consider the survey design and sampling. I don't know why this is here. First of all, multi-stage sampling. In most national dietary surveys, such as the US NHANES and in New Zealand, they have multi-stage sampling divided up into 4 stages, with a random sample at each stage. The first stage is at the provincial level, the second stage at the district level, the third stage, communities within the district, and finally, the 4th stage can be households if they're interested in a household survey, or individuals if they're interested in a target group-based sampling for preschool children, for example, or women of reproductive age. The second thing we have to consider is the study population and our exclusion criteria. Are we only going to consider non-institutionalized civilians? That means we won't include the elderly that might be living in care homes, for example, or prisoners. Are we going to include breastfed children or not? If we decide to include breastfed children, we have to make the decision of how we're going to assess breast milk intake. Then we have to consider the target the demographic groups that are best defined by the same age bands. This means that this will depend on what reference values, nutrient values you use. For instance, if you decided to use the FAO-WHO nutrient reference values, then the age groups that they have for children are between 1 and 3 years and 4 to 6 years. So they would be your target demographic groups for children. So it's important to match your target demographic groups with the age band that you select for your nutrient reference values. Very important, because you're going to be using those nutrient reference values to assess the adequacy of the nutrient intakes. The third thing we have to consider are the survey domains that have been selected. Besides the age bands, we usually present our data by sex. We may present it, as I've said, by urban or rural areas and by ethnic groups. And we have to ensure that the sample size in each of these domains is adequate for the precision that we require. So this means before we go and see our statistician, we have to have made several decisions that we can talk to the statistician about to ensure that we get the right precision for each of the domains that we have selected. And finally, we need to consider our statistical plan. We need to ensure that in our final sample, we have weekdays, weekend days, sometimes market days. We have to take into account season, so that all seasons are represented within each survey domain. We may also want to consider cultural and religious practices. Are we going to include fasting days or feast days? This will affect very much the weighting factors that the statistician will apply to the final data set. The weighting is used to account for over or under sampling of certain populations. For instance, in New Zealand, we oversampled for Maori because we were concerned of getting high precision for the nutrient intakes of that particular ethnic group. We also have to recognize that we will have some non-response, particularly in large-scale national surveys. And intake.org suggests that the non-response rate should be assumed in a national dietary survey to be 20%. And this means that the sample size must be increased accordingly. Now I'd like to consider the sample size and response rate. The sample size that you finally decide on really depends on the variability of dietary intakes in your population. And I recommend that you look at section 2.4 in the PDF that I sent you by Dietary et al. That explains in detail some of the issues associated with sampling. It's very important to consult your statistician to calculate the sample size and achieve the desired precision. You will always find that the precision that you achieve is actually lower than the precision that's been calculated by your statistician because of the imprecise measurement of usual intakes. That's because our intake varies from day to day. It's never the same. If you consult intake.org, their advice is that you have 200 respondents per survey domain, that you add a design effect of 2 and a non-response rate of 20%. That results in 500 respondents per survey domain as a minimum. If you are interested in episodically consumed foods that are not necessarily consumed every day, you might need more than 500 respondents per survey domain. Planning for non-response can be high for national surveys, but there are things that we can build into our methods to try and reduce the non-response. We can have flexible recruiting times for our participants. We can advertise our national survey on the radio, the TV, social media, and we can select a 24-hour recall for our measurement because this has a low respondent burden. Now, in terms of the statistics of interest that you want to generate from your national dietary survey, it's important to list those statistics in advance because you may require some additional measurements to actually calculate those indicators. For instance, you may want information on BMI of your participants. This means you've got to measure height and weight. You may be interested to know of people who have BMIs above 25, for instance, what is their nutrient and food consumption pattern? How does it vary from people with BMIs that are less than 25 or less than 18? You may be interested in examining the energy expenditure, energy intake in relation to physical activity. That means you have to have data collected on physical activity. If you're interested in supplement use, you must include a special questionnaire on supplement use that I'll talk about later. If you're interested in ultra-processed foods or snack foods, then you have to consider the coding that will allow you to actually examine those foods separately. And then you might want to consider, are you going to examine the underreporting of energy intake or the overreporting of energy intake? If so, what method are you going to use? Because the method will require you to collect data on weight and height. The other factors that you always include are calculating the mean or median usual intake of your nutrients or foods or food groups, to assess the percentage of the group with inadequate intakes of a nutrient or excessive intakes of a nutrient. So you need to know what the upper tolerable level is for certain nutrients. You want to be able to assess the percentile distribution of usual intakes and food groups and certain foods. Another thing that I'd like you to alert you to is the facility by index called Data for Diets. This particular platform provides you with details of food security indicators that you may want to calculate from your national food consumption survey data. Important to look at these indicators before you start your survey, because some of them will require collection of additional data. So it's very important to list each of the statistics that you're interested in calculating, and by the side of each statistic, list the components that must be measured in order to generate that statistic. Now I'd like to consider the factors to consider for the survey planning in relation to the food composition table and supplements. Never start a national food consumption survey without a food composition table. You'd be surprised at the number of people who've done that. You must first examine what is available in terms of your food composition table, and you must look at what descriptors are used in your food composition table, because those descriptors in the food composition table must match the questions, the foods that you actually collect in the survey. So the probes that are used to describe the foods in the survey should match the probes in your food composition table. The second thing you must consider is, are you going to calculate before the survey starts the composition of some standardized mixed dishes? And how many standardized mixed dishes are you going to collect, and how are you going to collect that information? Intake.org suggests that to compile a standardized mixed dish, you need to have it cooked by 5 or 6 research assistants, in which the ingredients have been measured and the final weight of the cooked dish have been measured for that particular mixed dish. And from those 5 or 6 mixed dishes, you then compile the average composition of that standardized mixed dish to include in your food composition table. The next thing you have to make a decision about is, are you going to disaggregate the ingredients of each of your standardized mixed dishes, or are you just going to calculate the amount of the total mixed dish that's been consumed? This really affects your food source information. You can imagine that if you have a mixed dish that contains chicken, but most of the mixed dish is rice, and you have coded that mixed dish under rice without any chicken, then when you come to assess the contribution of flesh foods to iron and zinc intakes, it will be underestimated if all your mixed dishes are coded under the rice cereal group and you've ignored the contribution of the chicken in that mixed dish. So that's something that needs to be considered. Index 24 has just developed a platform called Global Food Matters Database that some of you may already be aware of. This is a database for dietary reference data, and it contains a lot of information on food composition values by country. So if you have difficulty finding food composition values for certain food, I recommend that you consult Global Food Matters Database on the Index 24 platform. It also provides you with information on recipes in terms of the ingredients in the recipes and the portion sizes. And it's also produced some portion size conversion factors. So it's a very useful platform to know about when you are setting up your food composition table. I also want to alert you to a platform that FAO, WHO have produced called FoodX2, which is used particularly for grouping foods so that we have standardized grouping of coding of foods across countries. That is another platform that FAO has produced, and if you're interested in adopting their FoodX2 coding system, I suggest that you contact FAO, who will provide you with further guidelines. They are trying to get all countries to adopt their FoodX2 coding so that we can have more uniform food nutrient source information from foods. Again, you might want to adopt special codes for ultra-processed foods or fortified foods if you're interested in the nutrient contributions from ultra-processed foods in your country or the nutrient contributions from fortified foods. What about dietary supplements? Increasingly, all countries are using dietary supplements. And it's information that should be obtained by a separate questionnaire. The USN Haynes has defined a supplement as a dietary supplement that provides at least 100% of the recommended dietary allowance or the adequate intake. They recommend that all the details about supplements that you obtain from the respondents should be recorded from the container of the supplement. So you need to ask the respondent to show you the container and write down the details, because respondents are not always clear about the units or the minerals that may be in their dietary supplement. USN Haynes also recommends that you devise a special questionnaire to assess the supplement use over the past 30 days. So they do not suggest that you get supplement information based on your 24-hour recall. They suggest that you have a separate questionnaire for obtaining information on supplement use. From this, you can assess information on the frequency of consumption. The US divides frequency of consumption into 0 days, 1 to 10 days, 11 to 20 days, or more than 21 days. Collect information on the amount usually consumed, and this will allow you to calculate the amount of the daily intake of nutrients from supplements, as shown here. It's very helpful in your dietary survey to express your results with and without supplements. Then finally, will under or over reporters be identified? What method are you going to use? And will the under reporters or over reporters be included or excluded in your final data analysis? That's a decision that you will have to make. The most common method for assessing underreporting is the Goldberg cutoff point that many of you are familiar with, but this requires that you do have data on height and weight of each individual in your survey. To obtain information on over-reporters, you can use the predicted total energy expenditure equation by McCrory et al., which is referenced in my text. Alternatively, of course, the gold standard method for assessing underreporting of energy intake is use doubly-labeled water, but that's a rather expensive and specialized procedure. Finally, are you going to measure physical activity during your survey? There are many different methods for measuring physical activity that range from heart rate monitors, accelerometers, activity diaries, or simple questionnaires. So a decision has to be made about which of those would be most appropriate for your use. So now we come to choosing a dietary method, and intake.org recommends that we use a 24-hour recall. This is the method that's also used by the USN Haynes and which has been used by many, but not all, national dietary surveys. I'm sure you have learned about the advantages and limitations of using a 24-hour recall, so I'm not going to go through each of these in turn, but nevertheless, it's important to recognize that there are some limitations with a 24-hour recall. It does require very skilled research assistants because the method itself is difficult. So your research assistants have to be chosen very carefully and they have to be trained rigorously. From my experience, it's best to select women for your research assistants for a 24-hour recall because they usually are more familiar with food preparation than men. I know in some previous national surveys, they've used the same enumerators that they used for the DHS survey, but that hasn't always been very successful because often those DHS survey enumerators are men who have rather limited exposure to food preparation. So this just summarizes the rationale for selecting a 24-hour recall. It has a low cognitive difficulty. It's fairly easy. Low potential for reactivity. That means less opportunity to change your eating pattern and is least biased. It allows cross-cultural comparisons. It's quick with a low respondent burden, so it increases the response rate. It does have random error. This is associated with day-to-day variation, which is the major random measurement error in any dietary assessment method. But we can control the day-to-day variation statistically. It also does have systematic error. Under and over reporting is present, but we can identify the under or over reporters in our final data set. We should include at least 2 24-hour recalls on at least a subsample, and this allows us to correct for the within-person day-to-day variation. So it isn't necessary to collect 2 24-hour recalls on every participant in your national survey, but you have to collect it on a subsample that's carefully chosen. We have to ensure that in the final selection of days, we do include weekend and weekdays, and also that we account for seasonality for each of our survey domains. So how do we select the respondents for the repeated 24-hour recalls, which are absolutely essential in order to obtain information on the usual nutrient intake distribution? These respondents must be selected randomly for the second recall from the sampling frame of individuals per demographic group. And the demographic group will, of course, depend on the nutrient reference values that you select. So for children, if you're using FAO, WHO reference values, then you will have one demographic group between 1 and 3 years of age, and a second demographic group between 4 and 6 years of age. So we need to have repeats in each of these demographic groups. The number of repeats that we require per survey domain has been recommended by intake.org as at least 50 individuals per demographic group that are randomly selected. Obviously, if you can repeat more than 2 24-hour recalls on a subsample, you yield greater reliability and precision of your estimates. But we recognize that sometimes this is not possible because it's more expensive. When should we do the repeats? The second recall should be conducted between 3 and 10 days after the first recall. And in our final sample of repeats, for each domain, we should ensure that each day of the week represents in the final sample of days. Now, some of you may read that in some cases, people have included a food frequency questionnaire and a 24-hour recall in their national survey. And this is done to improve the estimate of episodically consumed foods. However, this is not recommended for surveys in many countries because of the added expense, because the food frequency questionnaire that you use must first be validated for the population under study. And the statistical analysis that you use is complex, so it increases both the cost and the time of actually doing your national survey. Instead, intake.org suggests that if you're concerned about your precision of episodically consumed foods, the best option is to increase the number of repeats rather than carrying out a food frequency questionnaire at the same time. You should never include a food frequency questionnaire with your national survey that has not first been validated. That is a no-no. Now, in terms of your food coding, you have to make decisions about whether you're going to be adopting the FAO Food X2 codes for standardization, and whether your ingredients in your mixed dishes are going to be disaggregated. Are you going to have special food codes for fortified foods and ultra-processed foods so that you can calculate quickly the nutrient from fortified foods and ultra-processed foods or snack foods? And then finally, you have to make a decision about your dietary supplement data. So I'm sure you are all familiar with the sequence for a 24-hour recall. There are certain considerations that are of utmost importance when you're conducting a 24-hour recall that I want to emphasize again. We should always use the multiple pass interview format, because this has been shown repeatedly to enhance the recall of items consumed. It's also been shown that recall interviews can be conducted on adults and children greater than 12 years. But if you want to include younger children in your national survey, then they should be interviewed along with a primary caregiver to obtain information on their recent intake. And this generates what we call a consensus recall when it's combined with the primary caregiver and the child. It's always advantageous to conduct your 24-hour recall interviews in your homes. This encourages participation and improves the accuracy of the recall, and also facilitates calibration of household utensils that are used in that particular home. The interviewers that are conducting the 24-hour recall must be rigorously trained. The training usually takes about 3 weeks. They must be chosen to be personable, mature, non-judgmental, sensitive, and as I've mentioned, female interviewers are often preferred. Now, there are certain modifications that have been made for 24-hour recalls in low and middle income countries. Pre-training the respondents in the homes was something that we did when we were doing dietary work in Africa. We actually trained women in groups of about 30. Whether that is possible or not in your setting will depend on your setting. Nevertheless, sensitization about the survey to the community is very important to describe what's involved in your 24-hour recall, and also to stress to all respondents the importance of not changing what or how much he or she eats for the survey. That is absolutely critical. You do not want your respondents to change their eating pattern for the 24-hour recall. The object of the National Consumption Survey is to find the usual eating pattern of the respondents, not an eating pattern that's been specially made for the survey. You should explain to your respondents the consent process that will be involved, and then schedule your 24-hour recall visit, preferably in the home. Now, in some countries, we have used a pictorial chart of the local foods, and I'll show you one of these later, and have given our respondents instructions about ticking each food item as it's consumed on the day before the recall visit. There have been some concerns about including a pictorial chart because it's been of concern that respondents might think that they have to eat the foods that are displayed on the chart. We haven't found that an issue, but it's something to be sensitive to. And if you decide to use a pictorial chart, to emphasize to your respondent that the items on the chart are just examples of items that they may be consuming during the 24-hour recall period, but they are not ones that they should be consuming. Another thing that is very useful is on the recall day, to prepare samples of staple foods, which in Southeast Asia will probably be rice cooked in the traditional way as eaten, and preserving that sample of rice, that's the variety that's normally consumed in the area where you're working and prepared in the way that's normally prepared, preserve it with salt, and then the food will last about 1 week. And then if you take this sample preserved with salt to the household, you can ask the respondent to serve the actual portion size of each staple food consumed into their own dishes. And then you can weigh that portion size that's indicated has been consumed from their own dish and record the weight of that staple food directly in grams. It's particularly important to get an accurate weight of the major staples because obviously they provide the major source of energy in the diet and therefore must be accurately assessed. Increasingly, people are using graduated photo atlases, and I'll show you some examples, to display to the respondent to get an estimate of the portion size. If you decide to use a photo atlas, then that must be tested with some respondents first and validated before you use it. All these strategies are designed to enhance the recall of foods, reduce memory lapses, and improve portion size estimates. I'm going to see if I can close this. Yeah, that's better. Now, this is an example of the picture chart that I was talking about, which we used in Malawi, and we've also used it in Kenya. But as I say, if you decide to use a picture chart, you have to instruct your respondent that every time they eat one of these items, they place a tick by it. But it doesn't mean that they are expected to consume these items. So this is the format for a traditional multiple pass 24-hour recall that consists of 4 passes, which I'm sure you're all aware of. The first pass is the quick list, where we list all the foods and drinks, including water, sequentially during the preceding 24 hours, starting at the time of waking. The second path is the description, when we describe each item consumed in more detail, using our standardized probes that should match the description in your food composition table, and include details of the time of and the eating occasion. The third pass is when we go back to the beginning of our list and ask the amount of each food that has been itemized, and stress the amount eaten and not the amount served. And if possible, especially for our staple, we weigh it using our dietary scales. For each food item, we have to standardize the method that we're going to be using for estimating the amount that's consumed, and I'll talk about that later. The final 4th pass is the review, when we ask for details of any dietary supplements that have been consumed over the past 30 days using our questionnaire, and also if the food intake was unusual on the recall day. Perhaps your respondent was sick, or perhaps it was a feast day or a fasting day. You need to know these details. Now I'd like to go through in great detail the preparation for the 24-hour recall, because these preparatory stages are very important and unfortunately sometimes overlooked. The first thing you need to do to prepare for your 24-hour recall assessment is to compile a list of foods, recipes and ingredients that probably will be consumed in the area or the country where you're working. This means if you are not aware of the foods in that particular vicinity where you're working, you may have to go to the marketplace and find out the foods that are being sold, or you may have to have a focus group discussion with some respondents to generate information on your food, recipe, and ingredient list. The list should include fast foods, street foods, fortified foods, restaurant foods. Check the food descriptors that are used, and also consider what food codes you might use for these particular foods in your food, recipe, and ingredient list. This is when consulting Index 24 dietary data matters may be helpful, because that contains food composition data that you may want to add to your food composition table. The other thing you have to be concerned about is whether your food composition table actually contains the nutrients of interest. Maybe it doesn't contain, for instance, values for zinc, and you're interested in the zinc intakes of your respondents. Then that means you're going to have to find and add those zinc values to your food composition table before you even start the survey. So checking on the nutrients of interest in your food composition table are very important. The next thing you need to do is to compile your standard recipe database. How many recipes you're going to have as standard, in which you actually calculate the nutrient content from the recipe and add it as a line in your food composition database. And as I've mentioned earlier, Intec recommends between 6 and 10 replicates for each standard recipe, from which you obtain an average value. They also suggest that you prepare a laminated list of these standard recipes that your research assistants can carry to the home to remind them what are the standard recipes and which ones that they actually have to find information from the household. So you won't be perhaps collecting all standard recipes. You may want to collect individual recipes from the household. This is something that is quite complicated and requires you to spend a lot of time training your research assistants. Otherwise, you will get a lot of errors in these data. It's important to use a separate form and not to put this information on your 24-hour recall form, but to have a separate form for your enumerators to complete on your household mixed dishes. And again, you have the decision about whether the ingredients of those household mixed dishes will be disaggregated or not. The next very time-consuming effort is to standardize your portion size estimation methods for each food or dish. Intake.org recommends that you limit the choice of your portion size estimation methods to not more than 5 per survey. Otherwise, your enumerators find it rather complicated. And they suggest that you consider using salted foods for your major staples such as rice, Play-Doh models, and proxy weights using rice, beans, or water, and calibrated spoons or scoops. So those are the portion size estimation methods that Intake.org recommends. And for each food item that you may find appears in your recall, you have to designate before you start the survey how that portion size is going to be estimated for that food, so that each research assistant uses the same portion size estimation method for the same food. It's absolutely critical. So your research assistants need to have a list of what portion size estimation method they should use for each particular food. The next very time-consuming part is to develop your portion size estimation method conversion factor database in gram weight equivalents of edible portion sizes, because all your food composition data is given to you in grams. So your portion size estimation methods have to be converted into grams. So for instance, if you use rice as a proxy for instance, mung beans, so you want to find out the weight of mung beans, you actually ask your respondent to take out the amount of rice that represents the amount of mung beans that they consumed onto the plate on which they consumed the mung beans, and then you would weigh that amount of rice. But then you have to convert the weight of rice to what it would be if it was mung beans. So this is what I mean by your portion size estimation conversion factor database. And this has to all be prepared before you start your national survey. You also need to develop the probe list. These are the questions that you're going to ask the respondent to get a complete description of each food that's been consumed. And again, that probe list must be standardized across your research assistants, so that every time somebody, for instance, says that they've consumed rice, that you prompt for the right descriptors for that rice. Was it jasmine rice? Was it basmati rice? How was it cooked? And this descriptors must be matched to the match in the food composition table.
Okay.
Yes. Then you must develop a nutrient supplement database in which you have the brands that are available in your country listed, the type, the dose, and the composition. And that may take a lot of time. USDA has a supplement database that you can look at to see whether some of your brands are similar to the ones in the USDA, but you may have quite a lot of local supplements that are available for which you might have to collect local data. And finally, consider using FoodX2 to harmonize your food coding system. Allow time to identify and train suitable interviewers. So this slide depicts your pre-service fieldwork, training and piloting. Intake.org recommends that you use at least 3 weeks of training in dietary data collection for your field survey teams. You also need to include a formal pilot test in which you will have refinements made to your portion size estimation measurements. You refine your probe list of descriptors of each food so it's standardized across your research assistant. And also, if you're using computers or tablets for recording your 24-hour recalls, your research assistants will require training on using the computer or the tablet. Once you are convinced that your research assistants are clear on these points, then you have a final field test after training your field team and incorporating any refinements that you've incorporated in your pilot test. The timing of your survey period must consider seasonality. Surveys over a year will include holidays, fasting, feasting periods, and seasons. If you're only interested in a shorter survey, then you may avoid holidays and fasting periods. In all cases, you should include weekend days and weekdays. And fasting days should be reflected in your survey if you're doing it over a long period. Now I'd like to consider some details of training the interviewers control the measurement errors in the 24-hour recalls. So we have to overcome the possible non-response bias, we have to gently persuade the respondents to participate and also ensure privacy for the respondents. We found this was quite difficult in Malawi, but you really do want to ensure that your respondents have a private place in which they can recall what they've consumed. To overcome interviewer bias, we recommend holding group interviewer training sessions and using a standardized protocol so that each of your enumerators has to interview using this standardized protocol. And you can then check on the agreement between the interviewers if each of them are using the same standardized protocol. To minimize respondent memory lapses and elicit correct description details, use your multiple pass, train your interviewers if you're using picture charts, and photographs if used. To obtain the correct portion size estimates, use your standardized method for each food item and train the interviewers on their use. Portion size estimation is the source of the largest error in a national dietary survey. This is your picture chart, Howard. This is some data on respondent memory lapses from a study that Dr. Elaine Ferguson undertook in rural Malawi. In this particular study, she carried out a weighed record, and then the next day, she went back to the same household and performed a 24-hour recall. So she was able to check against her weighed record how many omissions and additions had occurred in her 24-hour recall by the women who were the respondents. And these are the items, and we can see that 17 of the respondents omitted fruits from their recall, even though they were present on their weighed record, and 22 omitted cereal snacks from their recall, even though they were present on their weighed record. So memory lapses are certainly a consideration that must be addressed. This slide gives some examples of the food descriptors that have been used in the West African food composition table for chicken. So these are the various types of chicken that appear in the West African food composition table with the description. So to match the chicken that's been consumed by your respondent with the food composition table values, it's important to have probes that match what's given in the food composition table shown here. And this slide gives you some examples of some pre-specified methods to estimate portion sizes for various types of foods, shown here. And this gives us a bit more details about the type of measurement aids that we can use. Household measures, particularly if you're carrying out your 24-hour recall in the home, then you can calibrate with water the volume of the cups or the spoons. often a measuring cylinder can be used for measuring the volume of soup that's been consumed, or a measuring jug. We can weigh foods directly, particularly our staple foods. Intake.org recommends that if you're using Play-Doh, you use white Play-Doh, which is shaped into portion size consumed, and serve that portion size on the respondent's plate or bowl. So after you've molded your Play-Doh into a shape that and size that the respondent says they consumed, place it on their own plate or bowl, because it's easier then for them to see that indeed it's the right amount. You can use free-flowing rice or beans, the same variety that's consumed in your area, for pourable food items to yield proxy weights, as I said, described for mung beans. We can use graduated food models. And for some items like eggs, peanuts, grapes, guavas, sliced bread or biscuits, or bottles of yogurt, we can use a standard unit size, the number of eggs that's been consumed, the number of peanuts, the number of grapes, the number of guavas, etc. These are examples of some portion size estimation aids that have been used in various national food consumption surveys. This is ones that have been used in Europe. This is used by the USN Haynes. They don't go into the household, so they can't actually use Play-Doh to model the size and shape that's been consumed. So they present these various Play-Doh models. But if you're able to go into the household and mold your Play-Doh into the size and shape that's been consumed and then weigh it, then it's a big advantage. And this is some data again from Elaine showing the comparison of the median recalled weight from the 24-hour recall versus the same day weighed record for these particular food items. And you can see the ones that are asterisked are significantly different. There are some significantly different differences between the weight that's been recalled in the 24-hour recall versus the weight that was weighed in the same day weighed record. This slide on the left shows the effect of ignoring season on energy intakes in a study undertaken in rural Malawi, where they measured energy intake for every month for 1 year. And we can see between January and March, there's a marked decrease in energy intake. This is because it's the rainy season when roots, tubers, fruit, legumes, vegetables disappeared from the Malawian diet. This will also impact on the nutrient intakes, because for nutrients that correlate with energy, such as the macronutrients, minerals, and B vitamins. On the right, we have a table showing the impact of ignoring the effect of fortificants in foods. Here we have the intake of iron, zinc, vitamin A, and folate from a database that ignored the contribution of these micronutrients from fortified foods. On the right, we have the results using the correct database in which the fortified foods have been added. Clearly, the intake is much higher with the contribution from the fortified foods. If we don't include the fortified foods, we end up with a greater proportion of women who have inadequate intakes. This is very important because yearly fortified foods are being added in the marketplace. So we need to continuously update our food composition table to include new fortified foods. Snack foods are very, very common, particularly consumed by young children. And here we have an example of what they used in the UK for assessing processed foods such as snack foods, they had pictures of the commonly consumed snack foods, and they showed it to the respondent and asked them to select the item that was most closely the one that they consumed. And also the amount of the packets that they ate. Was it one packet or more than one packet? Or did they only eat half a packet? Now this slide shows how to calculate the portion size estimation conversion factors using a white Play-Doh model for a boiled chicken leg. So what's happened here is that the research assistant has molded the white Play-Doh to form the amount of chicken leg that was consumed by the respondent. Now, to convert that Play-Doh chicken leg to the precise weight of the chicken leg in grams, we need to know the density of the Play-Doh. So if you're using Play-Doh, you first of all must, before you start the survey, have a table of the density of the Play-Doh that's used, which this time has been calculated as 1.4 grams per milliliter. Intake.org also cautions that the density of Play-Doh may change during your survey because it might lose water. So you should keep measuring the Play-Doh density and not just measure it once. You also need information on the density of a boiled chicken leg. Now, FAO has a very nice database of densities that you can use, but if your food is not in that database, then you have to generate the density of that particular food. And using these densities, you can then generate a portion size estimation factor, which is 1 divided by the density of Play-Doh times the density of your chicken leg, which gives you 0.64. And then the amount you weighed. So you weighed 156 grams of Play-Doh to represent the amount of chicken consumed. You multiply that 156 by your conversion factor of 0.64, which gives you 100 grams. And that is the amount of the chicken leg that was actually consumed by the respondent. So you obviously don't put in 156 grams of Play-Doh here. You convert that Play-Doh to the amount of chicken leg, that it is 100 grams. Now, to finish, I just want to remind you that there are various programs that are available that can be used for 24-hour recall interviews. And there are these 4 options that you might want to consider. There are some generalized survey programs that are free that you can actually customize to a standardized multiple pass format, offline, on the laptop or tablet. And these are some examples of free survey programs that can be converted. You can modify an existing web-based 24-hour recall for use in low and middle income countries. And these are some examples of these web-based programs that are available. Thirdly, you can use the new Index 24 mobile app, which also has this platform for dietary data matters. This is going to be launched in June, so you can keep a watch on the Index website when they're going to demonstrate the use of the Index 24 mobile app, which automates the 24-hour recall interview, standardizes the format, the sequence, the questions, standardizes the description of food items and methods for quantifying the amounts. Or you can create an entirely new data acquisition procedure for your 24-hour recall that embodies your own food composition table. So there are various strategies that you can investigate for producing a mobile app for your 24-hour recall rather than pen and paper. And there are many benefits of using your an automated multiple pass 24-hour recall, but I'm very conscious of the time here, so I'm not going to go through each of these in turn, but I would advise you to look carefully at the benefits of using an automated method. It standardizes your procedure across interviewers. And this gives you the sort of information that your program should save in Excel from each of your respondents. For each food consumed, you need to have the subject ID, the time of consumption, the numerical food group code that you've chosen, and the food code, and the food description that matches the food composition table, and the amount consumed in grams. There should be no blanks fields in each line, except in the case of user-specified foods when your numerical code will be absent. So if there's a food that's consumed by your respondent that's not listed in your food composition table, then you need to have a user-specified food to be added later. And this is the post-data collection processing. Most food composition tables should contain cooked and raw foods and some standardized recipes. Your food composition table must contain your gram weights, and you should be able to adjust for any fat absorbed by the food through cooking, and for nutrient retention and yield factors. And I've given you some examples that you can take away with this PowerPoint presentation of how to use nutrient retention and yield factors to calculate the nutrient content of a recipe from raw ingredients. And now we come to calculating our actual intakes to usual intakes. Presumably they have gone through this with Elaine, Umi, is that correct?
The IMAP, the participant has learned with the MSM version.
Okay. So this is the program that I would recommend that you use is this multiple source method program. It's the easiest program for converting your actual intake to usual intakes. Okay. Only if you're interested in fortifying foods should you use IMAP. It's more difficult. MSM, based on our experience, is easier to use than IMAP. So why do we use this program? Just to remind you, this solid line gives you the distribution of intakes based on a single 24-hour recall. This is data from a national survey undertaken in New Zealand on zinc. When we repeated the 24-hour recalls, we were able to get an estimate of within subject variability. This allowed us to adjust the distribution using a computer program such as MSM to the usual intake distribution, which is shown by this dotted line. And you can see it's a much narrower distribution after adjustment. This means that when we apply the EAR cut point approach to estimate the prevalence of inadequate intakes, we get a much lower prevalence of inadequate intakes using our usual intake distribution than using our observed intake distribution based on a single 24-hour recall. So in order to generate the accurate estimates of the prevalence of inadequate intakes you must include some repeats of your 24-hour recalls for each of your domains so that you can adjust the actual distribution to the usual intake distribution using a computer program such as MSN. It's very important to recognize what nutrient reference value you need to use to estimate your prevalence of inadequate intakes in a national survey. And what you use is the estimated average requirement. So this is why it's very important when you're looking at what nutrient reference values to use, that you check that those nutrient reference values contain the values for the estimated average requirement. You don't want the information on the recommended nutrient intake. It's the estimated average requirement that you are interested in for assessing the prevalence of inadequate intakes using the cut point approach. If you only have an adequate intake and not an estimated average requirement, which is the case for some nutrients, for instance, something like selenium, for example, you may not have an estimated average requirement, but you've set an adequate intake, then all you can do is to say that if the mean usual intake of your particular group is at or above this level, that implies a low prevalence of inadequate intakes. But you cannot say anything if your intake is below the AI. If you're interested in assessing the prevalence of intakes above the upper level of intake, then you should choose some nutrient reference values that give you upper level of intake values, and then you apply the upper level of intake as your cutoff to assess the percentage at potential risk of adverse effects from excessive intakes. The only nutrient for which you cannot use the EAR cut point approach is iron. For iron, you have to use a full probability approach because the distribution of iron requirements is skewed. And your MSN program will allow you to do that. So you can use your MSN program for iron once the distribution of observed intakes has been adjusted to the usual intake distribution. You can also calculate the prevalence of inadequate intakes of iron manually. And the procedure for calculating it manually is given in this particular reference that can be downloaded free from the Harvest Plus website. So I've mentioned these two new developments to standardize and enhance the quality of national food consumption survey data. Intake.org, I really advise you to check the website for intake.org. I have provided you with some of their many resources as PDFs, but you might want to go back to the website because they have many other resources that might also be useful. The International Dietary Data Expansion or Index project between Tufts, FAO and IFPRI have this new Index 24 mobile app that's going to be launched in June. They also have this Global Food Matters database platform that I've talked about, and also a platform called Data for Diets that gives you a list of food security indicators, some of which you may want to calculate from your national food consumption data. And so it's good to look at those food security indicators to see if there are any additional information you need to collect in order to calculate them. And finally, I want to alert you to a new FAO/WHO Global Individual Food Consumption tool called GIFT. FAO would like all people carrying out national food consumption surveys to subscribe to GIFT. They are compiling then a database of all national food consumption data so that it will be available to countries around the world. If you subscribe to their database, they will be able to provide you with a set of food-based indicators in the field of nutrition and a set of food-based indicators that they will calculate from your data in the field of food safety. These sets of indicators will then be available to your country that you can use for programs and policy. There's a lot of other data that they also produce, but for the moment, I'm going to talk about these things which I think are most important. So once you have completed your national food consumption survey data, I urge you to consider subscribing to the FAO/WHO GIFT platform, and they will then calculate from your data some food-based indicators in the field of nutrition and food safety that will be useful for policies and programs in your country. And finally, I'm not going to go through this, but this just lists some new applications of dietary data that can be used from a national food consumption survey. And they're applications that are useful to convince administrators of the importance of conducting a national food consumption survey at the individual level in your country. Many people are not aware of the many applications that we can use the data for. So I think it's very important to have a list of applications that you can provide and lobby to provide funding for a national food consumption survey in your country. And this is a list of useful references that I have actually provided for you that you can access. There are some other slides that I'm not going to go through, but they're slides that you will find useful, particularly for calculating the nutrient composition of standard recipes and lists of resources for field yield factors and nutrient retention factors. So I'm sorry, students, I seem to have taken longer than I anticipated, but we do have time for questions.
Thank you, Prof, for the very comprehensive presentations. I think we don't extend. We just start a little bit after 9. So we can now welcome some questions. And
so how do I access the questions? What happens? I have no.
So then we will view it on the screen. So now, Rose, you can stop sharing. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So we can see together the questions on the screen. We have quite some questions here from the participants. The first one is from Dr. Lin Marlaing from Myanmar. She's also involved in the country FCS. So it is about the use of pictorial charts to be used in the recall day. We need to have the list of food items to be included in the chart, and this should be prepared in advance. So can you please suggest us how should we usually have that list for the pictorial chart? Because in Myanmar, by the time they conducted the Myanmar Micronutrient and Food Consumption Survey, they used the list of the food items commonly consumed by the population based on the previous FCS. But the list may sometimes not specific to the specific target. So what do you advise?
Yes, that's a good question. I think what the way to compile that list is to actually conduct, before you start the survey, focus group discussions with the target groups that you're interested in to find out what foods they actually commonly consume. You won't be able to have a list of every single item on that pictorial chart, but at least you'll be able to include the foods that are commonly consumed by your specific target group. The other suggestion is to go to the marketplace in that area where you're conducting the survey to find what foods are sold. That also gives you information on the most common food items to add to the pictorial chart. Does that answer that question?
I hope that answers Dr. Lai from Myanmar. Now we can move to the next questions, please. From Rika, she's also from the Indonesian FCS team. And she has 3 questions. First, about foods which are rich in condiments. Yeah, this is typical in Asian food. Should we include this group in analysis? And then,
well, shall I answer that question first?
Yeah.
The answer is that yes, condiments contain quite a lot of trace elements. Okay, so we really should include condiments in our recipes. Yes, we should include the nutrient composition of condiments. Again, I think you will find that USDA has the nutrient composition of many, many condiments. If you can't find them there, maybe you will have to resort to examining food composition tables from other countries. But certainly the major condiments that are used should be included as an ingredient in your mixed dishes.
In some countries, they are even fortified, yeah, the condiments like this sauce.
Yeah, that's true. You're right on me. Yes.
The second question is about which one is better, to analyze food data in raw weight basis or cook weight basis, because in the FCT, in our FCT, we may find so many mixed dishes. We don't have cook food, yeah, that is the first one, and also because of many mixed dishes with different recipes in each region. So basically in Indonesia, mostly we have the raw foods in the FCT. So
yes, many countries only have raw foods in their FCT. India is another country that only has raw foods. So what you have to do then is you have to actually find a source of nutrient retention values for your raw foods, because obviously for some nutrients after preparation and cooking, some of the nutrient value will be decreased once the food has been cooked. Now, the database that I told you about that Index has, I think it's Diet for Data. They have a lot of a database for retention factors on that particular platform. And I have also listed in one of the additional slides in the PowerPoint that I didn't go through, a list of resources where you can access retention factors for a large number of different foods. Okay, so you will need to access retention factors to convert your raw foods to cooked foods. The other factor that you will need to access when you're calculating recipes from raw foods is a yield factor, because the weight of your raw foods, if you add them up, will differ from the final weight of the cooked foods. And again, there is a database that I actually have included in one of the PDFs of yield factors that were developed by the USDA. Now, of course, some of those yield factors may not be appropriate for some countries in Southeast Asia. So you may have to examine other sources of yield factors to calculate the standardized recipes from raw foods. So I have actually shown you an example of what's considered by FAO to be the best method for calculating a mixed dish from raw ingredients. There are 3 or 4 slides given to you at the end of the PowerPoint that may help you in that process. Is it possible to have you? Oh. Does anybody have any questions about that? Was that clear?
So Rika is joining to the YouTube, so I hope that is clear, yeah, because I cannot see in the Zoom. And the third question Ross is about from Rika is about when we disaggregate plenty of mixed dishes, is it possible to have nutrient intake over-reporting? So over-reporting of the nutrient.
Oh. We disaggregate plenty. Well, if it's not done correctly, it will be over-reported. It depends on how well it's been disaggregated. The reason for disaggregating the ingredients is because, particularly if you're interested on the food sources of nutrients, that's when the disaggregation process is so important.
So please estimate right the type and the portion, and also the FCT should be a close estimate, yeah. Okay, so
in theory.
More questions? Can I have the next question, please? This is from Indri from Indonesia.
Okay.
She asked about because some references, even some surveys categorize intake to mild, moderate, severe deficiency by using a cutoff like less than 70% of energy, protein, or less than 77% RNI. So can we use that for evaluating the risks of inadequacy or using EAR? And how about micronutrient, which we don't have EAR?
Okay. So you shouldn't use the RNI. You should try and find a source of your nutrient reference values that gives you an estimated average requirement. And then you can evaluate the prevalence of inadequate intakes correctly. Okay. So that is the correct way of doing it, not just looking at less than 70%. I know that's been done in the past when there hasn't been an EAR, but I would urge you to seek out a source of estimated average requirements rather than using the recommended nutrient intake. In terms of the macronutrients, then of course we don't use the EAR. We have to look at the macronutrient distribution levels. So the process of examining the macronutrients is very different from the process of examining the micronutrients. And I suggest that you look at my chapter, which is up on the web now in nutritionalassessment.org, on evaluation of nutrient intakes, because I actually describe in some detail how to evaluate macronutrient intakes. Okay, it's under the chapter called Evaluation of Nutrient Intakes. It talks about both examining the adequacy using EARs, but also the adequacy using the macronutrient distribution levels.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Gibson, for the answer. And just for your information, we currently have a conversion factor for countries who don't have EAR to convert the RNI to the EAR in the fortification book.
Yeah, you do. Yes, you're using the same ones that FAO WHO used in the 2006 book.
Yeah, the fortification guideline book.
I know the guy.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that you've got to be sure that the way the RDA was set was the same way.
With the reference, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's That's the best that the country without ER can do at the moment, yep, Ross. But the best is we have the ER, or do you have any other advice?
Well, what I would suggest that all countries use both. They use their own converted EARs, and they use the EARs that have been set by FAO, WHO, because then they will be able to compare their data across countries. If they use their own EARs, they can't do that. So I think they should use both, is my advice.
Okay, thank you. And that is a very important message for those of you. So please use also the FAO RNI. At ER, sorry. So next question. Can I see that, please? Okay, so we have been practicing about assessing energy under and over reporters, yeah, also in your slide called Proc and Macrory. But how about pregnant and lactating women?
You can't do that because they're not in energy balance. I don't know of a method for, you can't use the Goldberg cutoff point for those groups. It's not appropriate. They have to be in energy balance. You can't use it. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question. There may be something that's been developed since I wrote my text that I'm not familiar with. So, but I don't know of any decent method of detecting under or over reporting in pregnant women, except looking at the relationship between their energy intake and energy expenditure in some way. I don't think there is one.
Yeah, so it could be the future development how to assess this, yeah. But currently it's not for pregnant and lactating women.
There isn't, as far as I'm aware, unless something has been developed that I'm not aware of, I don't think there is a method for those two groups.
Yeah. So I hope that answers Fitya from Indonesia. And the next slide for the next question. This is from Noel Santos from Philippines, asking for survey or intervention studies, what is the best dietary assessment method if it is for school children, aged like 10 years and above? What do you suggest?
So this isn't for a national survey, this is for an intervention study. Well, my view is that if you want to get accurate data on school children between 10 years and above, you're better off using weighed records.
To be more precise, and this is still also young.
Yeah, and they're young children, and so that, yeah. It's a bit, I mean, it suggests that you can get good 24-hour recalls from children 12 and above, but 10 years, I think really, if you're not doing a large-scale survey and you are able to do weighed records, then you should do weighed records.
Yeah. So I hope that answers Noel Santos from the Philippines. Next question. From Cambodia, Dayut, asking how to minimize social desirability bias when conducting 24-hour food, I think dietary recall, yeah? Or food record. So is it FR, food record? So is it better to increase the number of repeat 24-hour food records or dietary records rather than increase the sample size? So each one is more recommended, more days or more people, more sample?
Okay, I actually looked this up and I was reading about this, and intake.org suggests that it's better to increase the number of repeats rather than increasing the sample size.
So straightforward answer, that answers your question, Dayut from Cambodia. And we still have questions? Okay, we have question from Mar asking for national or large survey. Should the food list in the FFQ, the validated one, vary per area or region with seemingly different diets. So this is like a case also like Indonesia. If you know, we don't have the same food pattern from the westernmost to the easternmost. So what do you suggest?
Well, if you want to include a food frequency questionnaire that's valid and meaningful, then you should use a Pacific food frequency questionnaire for that particular region. You shouldn't use a standardized food frequency questionnaire for the whole country if it varies so much by region. The point of using the food frequency questionnaire would be lost then, would be waste of time doing it. So you need to, if you want to do that, to look at episodically consumed foods, you'd have to have a tailored food frequency questionnaire for that region if there are large differences in food consumption patterns across the regions.
Thank you, Rose. So culture specific, yeah. So within country, if you see like culture varied, then you have also a different FFQ to administer. So is it the last question, or we still have a question, Laras and the team?
I think we have the last questions. Yeah, we can show the slide number 11.
I think I'd like to also say that a cautionary comment about food frequency questionnaires, just to remind the students that food frequency questionnaires are seldom accurate for all the nutrients. So their level of accuracy depends on the nutrients. So they're really a better instrument if you're only interested in a nutrient which occurs in high amounts in certain foods. It's very difficult to design a food frequency questionnaire for all nutrients that's equally accurate for each nutrient. It's a real challenge.
Thanks for the advice, Prof. Gibson. And here I think it's kind of like a general comments and advice from you as an expert in this area. So what do you think, this is from Mark, what do you think are the top knowledge gaps that need to be filled, particularly in Asian countries? What are your advice for the young researchers who are to be pursuing in this field? So what kind of skill set do we need? So advice from the teacher.
This is for dietary assessment, Umi, particularly in relation to dietary assessment.
I think so, yeah, in this area, nutrition dietary assessment.
Okay. I think it's important that researchers have a good understanding of compiling food composition data. I think there's a lack of understanding about food composition data, particularly when we use a computer program for doing the calculations and we don't understand the limitations of the food composition data that we're using. So I think having a good knowledge of food composition tables and also things like nutrient retention factors and yield factors are very important when we're doing dietary assessment work. People sometimes just ignore those things, and yet it's very important. You can't calculate the nutrient content of a mixed dish using raw ingredients without adjusting both for yield factors and nutrient retention. And the second thing is, I think it is important to understand how to interpret the data and to recognize that dietary data doesn't provide us with information on deficiencies. In order to find out about deficiencies, we actually have to include biomarkers. It provides us with information on risk of inadequate intakes or excessive intakes. Okay, that has very important information with many applications, as I've shown you, but we do have to recognize its limitations. Okay. So the interpretation of the data and the importance of high quality food composition data, I think is very important.
Thank you for the advice, and I couldn't agree more, Prof. Gibson, the importance of FCT to ensure a good quality of our dietary data. And I think that is the last question from our question answer sessions, Professor Gibson. And we are now coming to the end of today's online lecture series. And we are really grateful and fortunate to have you with us, Professor Risalind Gibson. And before we end the sessions, we would like to share with you a small gift to show you, to extend our deepest respect and appreciation for your dedication and continuous support to us for nearly 2 decades. Now, so please, committee, you can share the screen. Yes, thank you, the committee.
Very touched, Jeremy. That was very kind. But I should say that how much I've enjoyed it, and so's Ian. We've really enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure and a privilege for us to be associated with you all. We've enjoyed it so much. It's really made a big difference to our lives.
Yeah, and especially we are
Wonderful.
fortunate.
Well, we are fortunate too. I think it's been both sides. We've gained a lot of wonderful friends. We've really enjoyed it. So it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And that really reflect and express what we feel all this time to know you as a great teacher and mentor. And Risalind, Prof. Risalind Gibson, today we are also joined by our director, Professor Dr. Muhtaruddin Mans.
Oh, nice to see you. Yes, I remember. Very nice to see you.
Prof. Muhtar would like to say some remarks for Prof. Gibson now that we can meet virtually. Please.
Sure. Yeah, nice to see you again, Prof. Risalind, and we are all happy that you are really good. Healthier than before, actually. I think it's because more than 2 years you can see your energy.
Yes, we're still going strong. Yeah, we're very fortunate. Ian and I keep very fit. Yes, we're very lucky. Very lucky.
Yeah, Mbak Laras, is there anything that we have to do? We have seen the video. It's from our heart. It's not just only display the picture, Prof. Risalind. It's really from our heart.
I know, and I'm very touched. It was a wonderful thing to do, and I much appreciated it. You're always so kind. But it's been a privilege for me to be associated with Samio. I've really enjoyed it. It's one of the highlights of my career. Real highlight.
Well, yeah. Bu Umi, may I continue?
Silakan, Pak.
Yeah, Prof. Risalind, our honorable guest lecturer from Otago University, New Zealand. Good afternoon from Jakarta. I think it's also afternoon in New Zealand. Yeah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. On behalf of Simrekpon, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude for your support to guide us and the participants on this very important topic of dietary assessment. It is really enhanced this seminar, and I believe every student, lecturer, and researcher in the nutrition field around the world know you for your famous textbook, Principle of Nutrition Assessment, that it has been displayed also in the video. And the world also acknowledges you as a well-known scientist who has received many awards and prizes from UK, US, New Zealand, just to name some, and is a founding member of the International Zinc Nutrition Consultative Group. And I also know that you have made a new generation for the international expert in the nutritional assessment that we have Ibu Umi Fahmida now. She is the international expert in the nutritional assessment. It is because of you, Prof. Gibson. Therefore, we and our participants from Southeast Asian countries are very fortunate that you remain supportive of our courses. For nearly 2 decades, you have been supporting our courses in nutritional assessment since 2003. You can see in the video, and more recently in best practice in the dietary assessment since 2018.
Yes.
We at Simrekpon has learned a lot from you, and hundreds of participants from Southeast Asian countries have benefited from your expertise in this area. We are truly fortunate to have your continued support, and on this occasion, we would like to present our most sincere appreciation. It's nothing but for taking time from your busy schedule to be the guest lecturer for our online courses on best practices in dietary assessment this year, 2022. Thank you very much. Prof. Gibson, please receive our appreciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a privilege and an honor to be associated with Samio. I'm a great fan of Samio. I think you do wonderful work. So it's been a privilege to be part of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mukhtar, for the remarks, and Prof. Gibson. This is again our most appreciation for your continued support. So it is nearly 2 decades. By next year, you are fully supporting us for 20 years, such a number and such.
Oh my goodness, I didn't realize that. Yeah, it's amazing. Well, it's been wonderful at Rumi.
The first
Yeah.
course, 2003. So thank you very much. And this also on behalf of Simrekpon and the participants. So thank you for all the participants joining us in the Zoom and also in the YouTube. I believe everyone leave today's session feeling, so to say, charged with new knowledge and also motivation to do it right, to do it the gold standard way for the food consumption survey many food consumption survey team attending your session now. I hope we'll keep the commitment to do better and better to publish the results. So thank you very much for the important information. And for the participants, kindly fill the evaluation form through the link posted in your chat box as a proof of your attendance to get the e-certificate. And this is the link, and please fill this, and we will send you back the certificate for you. And also, I think the most important thing, which I think Prof. Gibson would agree, is that the message coming from today's, I hope it will be something that you implement in your near future work. So it is my pleasure to be your moderator of today, Prof. Gibson. Send my regards to Ian, and we are looking forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
Yes, I hope so too, Umi. Yes, I hope we'll be able to come soon.
So on behalf of the committee, Prof. Risalind Gibson, and also participants, we apologize for any inconvenience during the webinar. We thank you for your attentions, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next online lecture series. Have healthy, good days, everyone. And again, Risalind Gibson, our respects and thanks for your sessions today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Umi. A pleasure.
My regards to Ian.
Oh, thank you. I will.
Thank you. See you
Thank you.
soon.
Everybody.
Prof.
Lovely to see you all again, and good luck with all your work. And things have been
Indonesia and New Zealand. Yeah, I haven't been New Zealand actually.
Oh, yeah, you'll have to come and visit. Yes.
Okay. Well,
Don't come at the moment. There's too much Omicron in Dunedin. Come when it's in the summer.
yeah.
Yeah, next time Prof. Gibson should also visit Sumedang, yeah, with Pak Mukhtar.
Oh yeah, Prof. Gibson. Yeah, we have the next one. Actually, we will